My name is Clara. I am 30 years old, and on Mother's Day, my own mother looked me dead in the eye and announced to an entire restaurant that she wished I had never been her daughter. I simply stood up, looked at her shocked face, and told her to live as if she never had one. I turned around and drove off in the very luxury vehicle my sister and her husband had just been bragging about. 15 minutes later, my mother texted me, threatening to call the police if I did not bring the vehicle back. I smiled coldly and sent a short reply telling her to go ahead. 30 minutes after that, three patrol cars surrounded them. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members. Growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, I learned early on that love in our household was entirely conditional. My mother, Patricia, was a woman obsessed with appearances, social status, and projecting an image of absolute perfection. My father, Richard, was a passive enabler who preferred to hide behind his newspaper rather than confront her toxic behavior. But the true star of the family was my younger sister, Audrey. At 27, Audrey was the undisputed golden child. She was beautiful, charming, and effortlessly capable of manipulating our parents into giving her whatever she desired. When she married Jamal, a 32-year-old African-American real estate broker, my mother felt that her grand social vision was finally complete. Jamal was a man who spoke entirely in corporate buzzwords and empty promises. He wore expensive suits and presented himself as a highly successful entrepreneur. My parents adored him. I, on the other hand, was the family scapegoat. I work as a forensic accountant for a major corporate firm downtown. My daily life involves hunting down financial fraud, tracing hidden assets, and exposing paper trails that white-collar criminals think they have buried deeply. It is a demanding career that requires sharp intuition, attention to detail, and absolute emotional control. However, in my family, my profession was nothing more than a convenient punchline. To them, I was just a glorified calculator who did not know how to live a real life. The contrast between my reality and their perception was jarring, but I had learned to weaponize my silence. I preferred to observe, collect data, and wait for the right moment to act. The catastrophe began on a Sunday evening. I had booked a private dining room at a ridiculously overpriced steakhouse in downtown Chicago to celebrate Mother's Day. I arrived early, making sure the reservations were in order, and the table was perfectly arranged. Patricia and Richard arrived shortly after. My mother wore a designer dress that I knew cost more than her monthly mortgage payment, while my father trailed behind her, looking typically disengaged. They took their seats immediately complaining about the city traffic and the lack of proper valet service. Audrey and Jamal arrived 40 minutes late, ensuring they made a grand entrance. Jamal swaggered into the room wearing a custom-tailored suit and a smug smile. He tossed the valet ticket for a brand-new top-of-the-line luxury sport utility vehicle onto the center of the white tablecloth, making absolutely sure that everyone noticed it. He boasted loudly about his booming real estate business, claiming the expensive new car was a personal reward for closing a massive deal. Audrey leaned against him, flashing a diamond tennis necklace and looking at me with her signature expression of condescending pity. I simply smiled politely and took a sip of my sparkling water. I did not offer congratulations, and I did not ask any follow-up questions about his supposed business triumph. My lack of enthusiastic validation clearly irritated my mother, who immediately launched into a glowing speech about how proud she was of Jamal and Audrey. The evening progressed into the gift exchange, a tradition my mother treated as a competitive sport designed to humiliate me. I presented my gift first. I had spent weeks tracking down a vintage first edition copy of her favorite classic novel. It was a thoughtful, rare, and deeply personal gift. Patricia unwrapped the delicate paper, gave a dismissive sigh, and pushed the book aside. She made a passive-aggressive comment about my lack of imagination and wondered aloud why I always insisted on giving her old, dusty things. I felt a familiar sting of rejection, but I kept my face entirely neutral. I was used to this routine. Then Audrey and Jamal presented their gift. It was a massive, ostentatious box from a high-end luxury retailer. Patricia gasped in exaggerated delight as she opened it to reveal a matching diamond bracelet to go with Audrey's necklace. She immediately put it on, holding her wrist up to the light, praising Audrey as the only daughter who truly understood how to treat her mother. The table erupted in fawning admiration. Audrey smirked at me, clearly relishing her victory, while Jamal leaned back in his chair wearing a look of absolute triumph. With the gifts opened, the psychological warfare shifted into its next phase. They began to openly mock my lifestyle, comparing my modest apartment and quiet demeanor to their flashy, high-rolling existence. Jamal laughed and joked that my forensic accounting job was a dead-end path for people with no real ambition. He confidently stated that I would never be able to afford the kind of luxury vehicles and diamond jewelry that they enjoyed. Audrey chimed in, suggesting I was simply jealous of their success and needed to stop being so negative. My mother nodded vigorously in agreement, adding that my single status and boring career were a constant source of embarrassment to her in her social circles. I sat there perfectly still, letting their insults wash over me like water. I did not react, I did not cry, and I did not try to defend my career or my life choices. What they did not know was that my forensic accounting skills had already uncovered the massive rotting foundation beneath their glossy facade. I knew exactly how Jamal had afforded that diamond bracelet, the matching necklace, and the shiny new vehicle parked outside. I knew because the paper trail led directly to my own front door. For the past year, Jamal had been systematically stealing my identity. He had managed to acquire my social security number, and he had been using my flawless credit score and pristine financial history to secure massive loans and premium lines of credit that his failing real estate business could never qualify for on its own. While they mocked me as a glorified calculator, I had spent the last 2 weeks compiling an irrefutable dossier of federal wire fraud and identity theft. I had mapped out every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, and every illegal wire transfer. And I had already submitted the entire comprehensive package directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I knew that the wheels of justice were already turning, and I was simply waiting for the inevitable collision. The tension at the table finally reached its absolute peak when the waiter approached to ask if we wanted to see the dessert menu. Patricia used the momentary pause in conversation to deliver her final crushing blow. She looked around the private dining room side and stared directly into my eyes. Her voice was loud, ensuring that the patrons at the neighboring tables outside our room could hear every single word. She proclaimed her profound disappointment in me, stating that I was a complete failure as a woman. Then she delivered the ultimate insult. She stated clearly and maliciously that she wished I had never been born into her family and that I was nothing but a burden to her. The surrounding area fell dead silent. My father looked down at his plate, refusing to intervene. Audrey and Jamal tried to hide their amused smirks. They all waited for me to break down, to cry, to beg for her forgiveness and approval, just like I used to do when I was a child. Instead, I wiped my mouth and stood up. I looked down at my mother's suddenly shocked expression and delivered my response. I told her that if she truly wished she never had a daughter, she could live the rest of her miserable life exactly that way. Without a single word, I picked up my coat. I casually reached across the table and grabbed the valet ticket Jamal had proudly tossed there earlier. I walked out of the restaurant. I handed the ticket to the valet, stepped into the stolen luxury vehicle, and quickly drove away. The storm I had meticulously prepared was about to finally make landfall, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming. I stepped out of the suffocating atmosphere of the private dining room and walked down the plush-carpeted hallway of the restaurant. The cool Chicago night air hit my face the second the heavy glass doors closed behind me. I did not look back. I simply walked up to the valet stand, pulled the heavy cardstock ticket from my coat pocket, and handed it to the attendant. He barely glanced at it before jogging off to retrieve the vehicle. Moments later, the sleek, midnight black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb. It was the exact same vehicle my sister and her husband had just spent the last hour bragging about to my parents. The valet opened the door for me with a polite nod. I slipped into the driver's seat, the scent of expensive leather filling the cabin. I adjusted the mirrors, pressed the ignition button, and pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the downtown traffic. To anyone else, it might have looked like Grand Theft Auto. But I was not stealing anything. I was simply taking possession of my own property. As I navigated through the glowing city streets, my mind reviewed the meticulous paper trail that had led me to this exact moment. Jamal thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was nothing more than a sloppy amateur. 6 months ago, I noticed a slight anomaly on my credit monitoring report. As a forensic accountant, anomalies are my specialty. I dig into discrepancies that highly paid executives try to bury, so unearthing Jamal's crude financial maneuvering was like solving a child's puzzle. He had managed to steal my social security number likely during one of the few times I had mistakenly left my purse unattended at a family gathering. Using my immaculate credit score and financial history, he had bypassed his own ruined credit to secure the financing for this massive, overpriced vehicle. But he did not stop at the car. His failing real estate brokerage was drowning in debt, so he used my identity to open premium business lines of credit and secure massive commercial loans. He thought he was untouchable because my parents constantly shielded him and Audrey from any real-world consequences. My mother had actively helped him falsify income verification documents, completely willing to destroy my financial future to fund the extravagant lifestyle she demanded for her golden child. Instead of confronting them when I found the first fraudulent account, I remained entirely silent. I spent weeks quietly building an airtight, irrefutable dossier. I traced every forged signature, cataloged every illegal wire transfer, and mapped out the entire network of federal wire fraud and identity theft they had committed. I did not hire a private investigator or send a warning letter. 4 days ago, I walked directly into the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office and handed the lead agent a comprehensive, neatly bound binder containing enough hard evidence to put my brother-in-law and my mother behind bars for years. I knew the federal arrest warrants had been signed by a judge yesterday morning. I was just waiting for the authorities to locate them. My phone began to vibrate wildly in the cup holder. The screen illuminated the dark cabin with a relentless stream of notifications. I ignored the first 5 calls, letting them go straight to voicemail. Then the text messages started pouring in. My mother was losing her mind. The first text was a furious demand asking where I went. The second text was a frantic realization that the valet could not find the vehicle. By the fifth text, the panic had shifted into pure, unadulterated rage. She typed in all capital letters demanding that I turn the car around immediately. She called me a psycho, a jealous failure, and a thief. Then came the ultimate threat. She texted that if I did not bring the vehicle back to the restaurant within 10 minutes, she was going to call the police and report it stolen. She promised me that she would make sure I went to jail, and that she would ruin my entire life. I pulled the vehicle over into a vacant parking spot just 3 blocks away from the restaurant. I put the car in park, picked up my phone, and read her unhinged threats with a sense of absolute calm. She wanted to use the police as a weapon to control me, completely unaware that she was standing on a trap door I had built specifically for her. I typed out a simple 2-word reply. Go ahead. I hit send, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and waited. I did not have to wait long. I rolled down the window, letting the crisp night air fill the cabin as I listened to the sounds of the city. Exactly 15 minutes after I sent that text, the distant wail of sirens began to echo through the downtown canyons. My mother had actually done it. She had dialed emergency services to report a stolen vehicle, furious and desperate to punish me. But in her arrogant haste to teach me a lesson, she had made a fatal miscalculation. When she called the police and gave them her exact name and location, she inadvertently flagged her profile in the dispatch system. The local police operators immediately saw the active federal warrants attached to her name and Jamal's name. She essentially delivered herself and her fraudulent son-in-law right into the hands of the authorities on a silver platter. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked back down the block, staying safely out of sight across the street from the restaurant. I wanted to witness the culmination of my work. 3 squad cars screeched to a halt right in front of the elegant dining establishment, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the expensive glass facade. 2 unmarked black sedans pulled up right behind them, and several federal agents stepped out adjusting their tactical vests. They did not rush off to search for a stolen car. Instead, they marched directly through the front doors of the restaurant. I stood in the shadows of an adjacent building, watching the chaotic scene unfold through the massive front windows of the restaurant. The upscale establishment, usually a bastion of quiet luxury and refined manners, had been completely upended. Diners at nearby tables paused mid-bite, their expensive wine glasses frozen in the air as the armed federal agents swiftly navigated through the dining room. I could see the exact moment the officers reached the private room where my family was still sitting. My mother, who had spent the entire evening loudly broadcasting her superiority to anyone who would listen, was suddenly cornered. Through the glass, I watched as an agent spoke to her. Her initial expression of entitled outrage rapidly dissolved into sheer, unadulterated terror. She pointed frantically toward the street, likely trying to tell them about the missing vehicle, completely oblivious to the fact that they were not there for a grand theft auto report. Jamal tried to stand up, his arrogant swagger entirely vanishing as two officers swiftly grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. The custom-tailored suit he had boasted about all evening suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of metal handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. My father remained completely paralyzed in his seat, his face drained of all color, doing absolutely nothing to intervene as his wife and his golden son-in-law were apprehended. Audrey was hyperventilating, clutching her diamond tennis necklace as if it could somehow protect her from the devastating reality collapsing around them. She screamed something at the officers, but the thick glass muted her desperate protests. The agents forcefully escorted my mother and Jamal out of the restaurant and onto the crowded sidewalk. Patricia tried to hide her face from the dozens of bystanders who had stopped to record the spectacle on their smartphones, her carefully constructed social reputation burning to the ground in real time. Jamal looked completely defeated, his head hung low as he was shoved into the back of a marked patrol car. Audrey stumbled out of the front doors right behind them, crying hysterically as she watched the vehicles drive away. She was left standing alone on the sidewalk, stripped of her pride, her ride home, and her perfect illusion. I watched the flashing lights disappear down the busy avenue, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound peace. My mother had wished aloud that she did not have a daughter. Tonight, as she sat in a sterile holding cell, facing serious federal fraud charges, she was finally going to experience exactly what that felt like. I turned my back on the restaurant, walked quietly back to my vehicle, and drove off into the cool night, fully prepared for the desperate warfare that I knew awaited me tomorrow morning. The sun had barely crested the Chicago skyline when my phone erupted into a chaotic symphony of vibrating alerts and sharp ringtones. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee, completely unbothered by the digital assault. I picked up the device and saw my sister Audrey demanding my immediate attention. I pressed the green button and held the phone slightly away from my ear, anticipating the auditory explosion. A frantic, high-pitched shriek instantly pierced the quiet morning air of my apartment. Audrey was completely hysterical, sobbing so aggressively that her words were barely coherent. She demanded to know what kind of sick, twisted game I was playing. Her voice cracked as she painted herself as the ultimate victim, screaming that I had orchestrated this entire nightmare out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. According to her warped reality, I simply could not handle seeing her happily married to a successful real estate broker while I remained a lonely, bitter spinster. She yelled that Jamal had spent the entire night locked in a filthy federal holding cell and that our mother had experienced a panic attack during her booking process. In Audrey's mind, my meticulously documented evidence of massive identity theft was nothing more than a minor administrative misunderstanding that I had blown wildly out of proportion just to ruin her perfect life. She ordered me to come down to the downtown police precinct immediately to clear up my supposed mistake and drop all the charges. I let her scream until she literally ran out of breath. I took another slow sip of my coffee, relishing the rich flavor, and calmly told her I would be right there. I disconnected the call before she could unleash another wave of delusional entitlement. I dressed in a sharp-tailored slate gray suit, the exact kind of professional armor I wore when dismantling corporate fraudsters in hostile deposition rooms. I drove to the downtown precinct with absolute clarity of purpose. I was not going there to rescue them. I was going there to look them in the eye and establish an impenetrable boundary. When I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the police station, The sterile fluorescent lighting illuminated a pathetic scene in the waiting area. Audrey was pacing the scuffed linoleum floor, frantically clutching a crumpled tissue. Her designer gown from the night before was heavily wrinkled, and her carefully applied makeup was smeared down her cheeks in dark, chaotic streaks. Sitting on a hard plastic bench nearby was my father, Richard. He looked thoroughly exhausted, his shoulders slumped as he stared vacantly at his expensive leather loafers. For my entire Richard had played the role of the passive bystander, constantly enabling my mother and sister, while quietly dismissing my achievements. But the moment I stepped into the room, he suddenly sprang into action, adopting the posture of a stern patriarch, demanding unquestioning obedience. Audrey spotted me first. She lunged forward, pointing an acrylic fingernail just inches from my face. She hissed that I was a monster, and that I was trying to destroy her husband's booming real estate empire. Before I could respond, my father stepped between us, holding up a hand to silence her. He looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment, utilizing the exact same psychological manipulation tactics my mother had perfected over 3 decades. He commanded me to sit down, treating me like an insubordinate teenager rather than a 30-year-old professional. I remained standing, my posture rigid and entirely unyielding. Richard lowered his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, leaning in close as if trying to reason with an irrational child. He launched into a lengthy, aggressive lecture about the sacred bonds of loyalty, leaning heavily on the family-first defense. He told me that family always protects their own, no matter what mistakes might have been made along the way. He framed Jamal's calculated federal crimes as a simple lapse in judgment, a minor misstep by a young, ambitious entrepreneur who was just trying to provide a beautiful life for my golden sister. My father crossed his arms and looked at me with chilling calculation. He argued that Jamal's entire real estate career would be completely obliterated if these felony fraud charges moved forward. He painted a tragic picture of Audrey losing her luxury lifestyle, essentially blaming me for her impending financial ruin. Then, Richard delivered the most insulting justification of all. He looked me up and down, sneering at my fierce independence. He stated that because I was single, had no children, and made a substantial income at my corporate firm, I could easily absorb the financial damage. He actually looked me in the eye and suggested that a ruined credit score was a minor inconvenience for someone with my empty, solitary lifestyle. He demanded that I walk up to the front desk, tell the detectives that I had given Jamal permission to use my social security number, and withdraw all the evidence I had submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. According to his twisted logic, tanking my own financial future was my fundamental duty as a sister. I was supposed to gladly fall on my sword, so Audrey could keep driving a luxury vehicle and attending high society galas. I listened to his entire speech without blinking, letting the sheer audacity of his demands hang in the stale air of the police precinct. It was a masterful display of gaslighting, an attempt to make me feel overwhelmingly guilty for simply refusing to be a willing victim. Richard genuinely expected me to capitulate. He thought his authoritative tone and his guilt-tripping rhetoric would break my resolve just as they had done when I was a child. But I was no longer the vulnerable scapegoat desperate for my father's meager approval. I was a highly trained forensic accountant who dismantled sophisticated criminals for a living, and his clumsy manipulation was nothing but an insult to my intelligence. I stared at Richard, my expression utterly devoid of any warmth or familial affection. I asked him if he fully understood the magnitude of what he was demanding. I asked if he realized he was actively telling me to commit perjury, to lie to federal agents, and to permanently destroy my pristine professional reputation, just to save a man who had shamelessly robbed me blind. Richard let out a harsh, frustrated sigh, waving his hand dismissively, as if my career was completely irrelevant. He reiterated that my job was just crunching numbers, whereas Jamal was building a legacy for Audrey. He insisted that I was being overly dramatic, and that a bad credit report could easily be fixed in a few years if I just worked hard enough. Audrey chimed in from behind him, her voice dripping with venom. She accused me of wanting her to be homeless, claiming that I was using the law as a weapon to punish her for being the favorite daughter. She screamed that if I did not fix this right now, she would never speak to me again, assuming that the threat of losing her toxic presence would somehow bring me to my knees. I let a cold, dangerous smile spread across my face as I absorbed their pathetic ultimatums. They wanted to talk about legacy and financial ruin, completely unaware of the absolute devastation I was currently holding in my briefcase. They believed the stolen luxury vehicle and the associated credit lines were the extent of Jamal's criminal enterprise. They thought they could browbeat me into submission by downplaying the severity of identity theft, framing it as a simple familial misunderstanding that could be swept under the rug with a single conversation at the front desk. But forensic accounting is never about the first crime you find on the surface. It is always about the massive, rotting web of deceit buried underneath the initial lie. I looked at my father's expectant face and my sister's tear-streaked, furious glare, recognizing that they truly believed they had won this psychological battle. They felt entitled to my sacrifice, demanding my absolute destruction to preserve their hollow, glamorous illusion. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase tightly, feeling the solid weight of the secondary evidentiary files resting inside. I had not come to this police station to offer them salvation, and I had certainly not come to negotiate a truce. I had come to drop the final, unescapable anvil on their fragile house of cards, preparing to unleash a revelation that would ensure Jamal never saw the outside of a federal penitentiary, effectively burning their demands to ashes. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the sterile atmosphere fill my lungs as I watched their arrogant, expectant expressions. They were about to learn that crossing a forensic accountant was the most catastrophic, irreversible mistake they could have ever possibly made. I broke the heavy silence in that sterile police waiting room by reaching down and unlatching the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp click echoed off the linoleum floors, a sound that finally wiped the arrogant expectation from my father's face. He had spent the last 10 minutes commanding me to walk up to the front desk and withdraw my federal complaint, assuming I was the same terrified little girl who used to bend to his every whim. He truly believed his booming voice and tired rhetoric about family loyalty would force me to absorb a ruined credit score so his golden daughter could maintain her pathetic illusion of wealth. I did not raise my voice, and I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked him dead in the eye and informed him that his understanding of the situation was fundamentally flawed. I told him he was operating under the delusion that Jamal was just an ambitious man who made a minor administrative mistake to buy a luxury vehicle. I watched Audrey cross her arms, still trying to project an air of superiority despite her smeared makeup and wrinkled designer gown. I told them both that forensic accounting is never about the first crime you uncover. The stolen sport utility vehicle was nothing more than a shiny metallic beacon pointing toward a much darker systemic financial rot. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a secondary massive black binder, slamming it down onto the hard plastic bench right next to my father. I watched Richard stare at the thick stack of documents, a sudden flicker of genuine apprehension breaking through his authoritative facade. Audrey uncrossed her arms, her eyes darting between the heavy binder and my completely unreadable expression. I placed my hand flat on top of the cover and delivered the reality check they had desperately tried to avoid. I informed them that Jamal did not just use my immaculate credit score to finance a luxury car. I had weaponized my social security number to orchestrate a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar real estate scam. I calmly explained that over the past 8 months, Jamal had secured fraudulent commercial mortgages on 3 completely non-existent ghost properties. He had fabricated appraisals, forged my signature on federal loan applications, and funneled the massive payouts through a labyrinth of shell companies disguised as his legitimate brokerage firm. I was not a struggling entrepreneur trying to provide for his wife. He was a prolific, calculating predator who was intentionally setting me up to take the fall for millions of dollars in federal bank fraud. Richard physically recoiled, the color draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of the crimes settled into his brain. He tried to stammer out a defense, suggesting that there must be some sort of accounting error or that I was misinterpreting complex real estate transactions. He clung to his denial, terrified of admitting that the man he had praised all evening at the restaurant was actually a career criminal. Audrey, however, went entirely pale. Her previous aggressive screaming morphed into a stunned, breathless silence. She stared at the black binder, as if it were a venomous snake, slowly realizing that the luxurious lifestyle she had constantly rubbed in my face was entirely funded by my stolen identity. She tried to deny it weakly, insisting that Jamal was a brilliant investor and that I was just trying to frame him because I was jealous of her perfect marriage. I ignored her pathetic attempts at projection. I did not waste my breath arguing with someone who was actively refusing to see the flames consuming her own house. Instead of engaging in another pointless familial debate, I picked up the heavy binder and turned my attention toward the secure double doors leading into the precinct's administrative offices. I had coordinated this moment perfectly. I knew the lead investigator assigned to my federal case, Detective Miller, was waiting just beyond those doors, processing the initial arrest reports. I walked purposefully toward the reception desk, leaving Richard and Audrey scrambling to follow me. My father grabbed my elbow, his grip tight and desperate, begging me to stop and think about what I was doing to the family name. I yanked my arm away with a sharp, violent motion, giving him a look so filled with absolute disgust that he physically stumbled backward. I told him that the family name meant absolutely nothing to me anymore, especially since they were so eager to let Jamal drag it through the mud. I approached the thick glass partition of the front desk and requested the lead detective by name. Less than a minute later, Detective Miller pushed through the secure doors, looking exhausted but deeply focused. He recognized me immediately, having personally reviewed the initial dossier I submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation days ago. I greeted him with absolute professionalism, completely ignoring the frantic, whispering panic of my father standing just a few feet behind me. I handed the massive black binder directly to the detective, stating clearly and loudly that I was submitting supplemental evidence regarding the ongoing federal wire fraud and identity theft investigation. I explicitly detailed that the binder contained verified bank statements, forged commercial mortgage applications, and digital footprints linking Jamal directly to the three fraudulent ghost properties. I watched Detective Miller's eyes widen slightly as he assessed the sheer volume of the new evidence. He flipped open the cover, scanning the top executive summary I had meticulously prepared. He nodded slowly, acknowledging that this new documentation elevated the case from a simple identity theft charge to a massive coordinated federal racketeering scheme. Audrey pushed her way to the front desk, her voice trembling as she demanded to know when she could take her husband home. She tried to use her usual charming manipulation on the detective, putting on a tearful display and claiming that this was all a terrible family dispute that belonged in a civil courtroom, not a police station. She begged him to set a bail amount so they could just leave and sort everything out privately. Detective Miller looked up from the forensic accounting binder, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. He looked directly at Audrey and Richard, completely shattering their lingering delusions of control. He stated with absolute unwavering authority that based on the initial evidence of flight risk, and now compounded by this massive revelation of multi-million-dollar commercial bank fraud, the federal prosecutor was taking full jurisdiction of the case. He delivered the crushing blow without a single ounce of hesitation. I informed them that both Patricia and Jamal were officially being denied bail, pending a comprehensive federal detention hearing. There would be no posting a bond, no returning to their suburban mansions, and no sweeping this under the rug. They were going to remain locked inside a federal detention center until a judge decided otherwise. The finality of the detective's words struck Audrey like a physical assault. Her knees buckled and she collapsed against the edge of the reception desk, unleashing a guttural, agonizing scream that echoed off the cinder-block walls of the precinct. She sobbed uncontrollably, realizing that her golden, untouchable status had just been permanently revoked by the justice system. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of absolute hatred and profound desperation. She screamed that I had destroyed her life, that I was a cold, heartless machine who cared more about spreadsheets than my own flesh and blood. Richard stood completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in silent horror as he watched his entire world disintegrate in a matter of seconds. He looked at me, hoping to find some trace of the compliant, desperate daughter he used to manipulate so easily. He found absolutely nothing. I did not flinch at Audrey's piercing screams, and I did not offer my father a single word of comfort. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire existence making me feel profoundly worthless, and I felt nothing but absolute unbreakable peace. I had stripped away their power, dismantled their financial illusion, and handed their primary abuser directly to the federal government. I turned to Detective Miller. Miller thanked him for his time and professionalism, and stated that I would be available for any further testimonies required by the prosecution moving forward into the trial. I adjusted my suit jacket, turned my back on my hysterically sobbing sister and my completely defeated father, and walked purposefully toward the precinct exit. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp early morning air of the city, leaving them trapped in the bureaucratic nightmare they had actively helped create. I had firmly established an iron boundary that they would never ever cross again. I walked slowly to my parked car, knowing the real war was just beginning, and I was completely ready to finish it. For the next 72 hours, the silence from my family was absolute. Jamal remained locked in a federal detention center, his request for release completely denied due to the overwhelming evidence of commercial bank fraud and his obvious flight risk. However, the temporary peace shattered on Thursday morning. Through my legal contacts, I received a notification that my father had somehow managed to post a massive bail for my mother. Richard had essentially drained his remaining liquid assets and heavily mortgaged their suburban home just to secure Patricia a temporary release pending her federal trial. I knew exactly what would happen the moment her designer shoes hit the pavement outside the courthouse. Patricia was a woman who fed on public perception and control. Being led out of a high-end restaurant in handcuffs had critically wounded her ego, and a wounded narcissist only knows one defense mechanism, which is absolute scorched earth retaliation. She reunited with Audrey, who was now living in a state of sheer panic without Jamal to fund her extravagant lifestyle. Together, they decided that their best strategy to survive the impending federal indictment was to completely rewrite the narrative and publicly destroy my reputation. By Friday evening, my phone began vibrating with messages from concerned colleagues and distant relatives. Audrey had taken to social media, launching a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign across every major platform. She posted a meticulously edited video of herself sitting on my parents' living room couch, wearing minimal makeup and a modest sweater to project maximum vulnerability. Patricia sat right beside her, clutching a tissue and looking tragically heartbroken. In the video, Audrey stared directly into the camera and tearfully claimed that her older sister had suffered a severe, terrifying mental breakdown. She spun an elaborate, entirely fabricated story about how I had always been deeply jealous of her perfect marriage to Jamal. According to Audrey's delusional broadcast, my jealousy had finally mutated into a dangerous obsession, driving me to steal family documents and manipulate financial records to frame Jamal for crimes he never committed. Patricia chimed in, playing the ultimate victimized mother. She wept for the camera, claiming she had spent years trying to get me psychiatric help, but I had refused, choosing instead to destroy our family out of pure spite. They painted me as a vindictive, unstable sociopath who had weaponized the legal system to tear apart a loving home. But the performance did not stop at mere character assassination. Audrey strategically placed a link in her video description, directing her thousands of followers to a newly created crowdfunding page. The campaign was titled Save Our Family from False Accusations. Audrey wrote a lengthy emotional plea begging for donations to help cover their mounting legal defense fees, claiming that my malicious actions had frozen all of their legitimate business accounts and left them entirely destitute. Within hours, the video had garnered thousands of views. Strangers were leaving comments calling me a monster, a psychopath, and a jealous failure who deserved to be locked away. Distant cousins and family friends who had never bothered to check on my well-being were suddenly sharing the video, expressing their deep sympathy for my poor, traumatized mother and my devastated sister. They were using public sympathy to farm cash from gullible strangers, actively monetizing the very fraud they had committed against me. I sat in my apartment watching their digital performance with a sense of clinical detachment. I did not post a rebuttal. I did not comment on their videos to defend my honor. Engaging in a public shouting match would only validate their false narrative and give them the attention they desperately craved. As a forensic accountant, I knew that evidence spoke far louder than online theatrics. But their desperation was escalating rapidly, and they were no longer satisfied with simply ruining my personal reputation. They wanted to obliterate my professional livelihood. On Monday morning, I arrived at my corporate office in the financial district, ready to dive into a new audit file. By 10 o'clock, my desk phone rang. It was the executive assistant to the senior partners informing me that I was needed in the main conference room immediately. When I walked into the expansive glass-walled room, I found the three senior partners of the firm sitting around the massive oak table, their expressions exceptionally grim. The managing partner, an imposing man who rarely involved himself in employee matters, gestured for me to sit down. He informed me that the firm had received multiple frantic phone calls that morning from a woman identifying herself as my mother, Patricia, along with my sister, Audrey. They had bypassed the standard human resources department and demanded to speak directly with the highest level executives. Patricia had fabricated a deeply damaging, highly detailed accusation. She told my bosses that I was currently under investigation for embezzling millions of dollars from a private family trust. She claimed that I had abused my position and my specialized forensic accounting skills to cover up my own massive financial crimes, and that I was currently trying to pin the blame on my innocent brother-in-law to escape federal prosecution. Audrey had corroborated the lie, insisting that my firm was harboring a dangerous financial predator and threatening to expose the firm to the media if they did not terminate me immediately. The senior partners looked at me clearly, expecting an explanation for the explosive allegations that had just been hurled at their prestigious firm. In the highly regulated, hypersensitive world of forensic accounting, even the slightest whisper of embezzlement or ethical misconduct could end a career instantly and trigger severe internal audits. Patricia and Audrey knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to trigger a corporate investigation that would force my suspension, cut off my income, and strip away the professional credibility I needed to maintain my federal case against Jamal. They wanted me destitute, panicked, and begging them for mercy. I looked at the three senior partners, feeling absolutely zero panic. I did not raise my voice, and I did not scramble to defend my character. I calmly opened my encrypted work tablet and projected my screen onto the conference room monitor. I informed my bosses that my mother and sister were currently subjects of a massive active federal racketeering and identity theft investigation. I explicitly stated that I was not the perpetrator of the fraud, but rather the primary victim and the key whistleblower who had handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation the entire case. To corroborate my statement, I pulled up the official communication logs between myself and the lead federal prosecutor assigned to Jamal's case. I showed them the verified documents, confirming that my mother had just been released on bond for federal wire fraud charges, and that Jamal was currently sitting in a federal detention center, having been denied bail. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted instantaneously. The senior partners, who had spent decades analyzing financial fraud and understanding retaliatory behavior from desperate criminals, immediately recognized the smear campaign for exactly what it was. The managing partner leaned back in his chair, disgusted by the sheer audacity of my family's actions, and assured me that the firm stood entirely behind me. The managing partner closed his notebook, dismissing the phone calls as a pathetic act of desperation from cornered criminals. He formally commended my absolute transparency and my unwavering professional composure under such extreme emotional distress. He advised the Human Resources Director to flag any future communications from my family members and forward those messages directly to the corporate legal department. I thanked the senior partners for their absolute trust, closed my encrypted tablet, and walked out of the main conference room with my career completely untouched and my professional reputation growing much stronger. Patricia and Audrey had fired their best shot, intentionally attempting to burn my livelihood to the ground, but their malicious coordinated efforts had failed spectacularly. They thought they were dealing with a weak, easily intimidated target who would collapse under the combined weight of social media, humiliation, and workplace sabotage. They were entirely wrong. I returned to my quiet desk, feeling a cold, heavily calculating focus settle over my entire mind. They had actively chosen to escalate this conflict into a highly public arena, proving that they possessed absolutely no remorse for the devastating financial crimes they had maliciously committed against me. Since my mother and sister were so intensely eager to destroy my life, using their fabricated lies, I firmly decided it was time to destroy their remaining financial lifelines, using nothing but the absolute truth. I opened a highly specialized database directly on my secure terminal, initiating a targeted aggressive search to locate exactly where Audrey and Patricia were planning to secure their next fraudulent bailout loan. With the senior partners of my firm fully backing my actions, I had unrestricted access to institutional financial tracking software that ordinary citizens do not even know exists. I bypassed the noisy, desperate social media circus my family was currently orchestrating. Let them collect pennies from gullible strangers online. I was hunting for the millions they desperately needed to keep Jamal from spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. It took me less than 2 hours to isolate a massive, highly suspicious digital footprint. Jamal, currently out on a heavily leveraged bail, was attempting to secure emergency private equity. His traditional banking avenues were completely dead, permanently frozen, by the federal asset orders I had initiated. Traditional lenders would not touch him, so he had pivoted to the shadow market of high-net-worth private investors. I traced a fresh sequence of panicked communications and soft credit inquiries, leading directly to a prominent Chicago venture capitalist named Winston Carmichael. I pulled Winston Carmichael's recent calendar alignments through a corporate scheduling vulnerability. Jamal and Audrey had somehow managed to secure a private dinner meeting with him for that exact evening. They were going to pitch him a massive fabricated commercial development project, desperate to secure a seven-figure cash injection that they could quietly divert to pay their mounting federal legal defense fees. They were planning to defraud another victim to save themselves from the consequences of their previous fraud. I printed out a fresh, unredacted copy of Jamal's true credit report, which was currently a catastrophic landscape of defaults and federal liens. I placed it in a crisp manila folder alongside the official federal asset freeze orders that explicitly prohibited Jamal from soliciting any new investments. I slid the folder into my briefcase, logged off my terminal, and headed straight for the restaurant. The dinner was taking place at an ultra-exclusive, dimly lit steakhouse overlooking the river. It was the exact kind of pretentious high society establishment my family always used to project their false illusions of wealth. I arrived 45 minutes after their reservation time, allowing them just enough leeway to build their fabricated pitch and get Winston Carmichael comfortable. I bypassed the hostess stand with absolute authority, scanning the dining room until I spotted them tucked away in a curved leather booth near the back. Jamal was wearing a meticulously tailored navy suit, leaning forward and speaking with aggressive, charismatic confidence. Audrey sat right beside him wearing a designer cocktail dress that was undoubtedly purchased with my stolen credit. She was smiling brightly, pouring expensive red wine into Winston Carmichael's glass, playing the role of the perfect affluent supportive wife. They looked like the ultimate power couple on the brink of closing a massive, legitimate business deal. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to collapse onto their dinner plates. I walked methodically across the dining room, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. I did not rush. I maintained a posture of absolute freezing calm, watching as the arrogant smiles on their faces remained perfectly intact until the exact second I stepped into their peripheral vision. Audrey noticed me first. Her hand actually jerked, spilling a few drops of the expensive red wine onto the pristine white tablecloth. The color instantly drained from her carefully contoured face, leaving her looking completely hollowed out and terrified. Jamal stopped his charismatic pitch mid-sentence, his jaw tightening as he stared at me like he had just seen a ghost materialize in the middle of the restaurant. Winston Carmichael looked up, slightly confused by the sudden suffocating silence that had just fallen over the table. He glanced at me, assuming I was a colleague or a friend dropping by to say hello. He had absolutely no idea he was sitting across from two federal criminals. I did not raise my voice, and I did not cause a theatrical scene. I simply stepped up to the edge of their booth, looked directly at the venture capitalist, and introduced myself. I stated my full name and my position as a senior forensic accountant. I kept my tone entirely clinical, completely devoid of any emotional inflection, which only amplified the sheer terror radiating from my sister and her husband. Jamal tried to stand up, his voice cracking as he aggressively demanded that I leave the table immediately. He attempted to laugh it off, telling Winston Carmichael that I was just an estranged, unstable family member trying to cause unnecessary drama. He desperately tried to wave the waiter over to have me removed, but I completely ignored his pathetic scrambling. I unlatched my briefcase, pulled out the crisp manila folder, and dropped it squarely onto the center of the table, right on top of Jamal's fabricated investment portfolio. I looked Winston Carmichael dead in the eye and told him he was about to make the most catastrophic financial mistake of his entire career. I informed him that the man sitting across from him was not a successful real estate mogul, but a desperate cornered criminal, currently out on federal bail for massive wire fraud and multi-million-dollar identity theft. Jamal lunged for the folder, trying to snatch it away, but Winston Carmichael was faster. The investor grabbed the file, his expression shifting from polite confusion to sharp calculating alarm. I told the investor to read the first page. I explained that it was a verified copy of Jamal's true unedited credit report, which showed millions of dollars in defaulted loans and active federal liens. I then pointed to the second document, explicitly identifying it as a federal asset freeze order signed by a judge just days ago, which legally prohibited Jamal from engaging in any commercial real estate transactions whatsoever. Audrey began to hyperventilate. She reached across the table, tears welling in her eyes, and begged the investor not to listen to me. She launched into the exact same smear campaign she had been peddling on social media, claiming I was deeply mentally unwell and trying to destroy them out of pure psychotic jealousy. She sobbed, promising Winston Carmichael that their investment plan was entirely legitimate and that my documents were completely fabricated. Her performance was desperate, loud, and entirely unconvincing. Winston Carmichael did not even look at her. His eyes were glued to the federal asset freeze order carrying an official government seal. He was a man who understood money liability and the devastating consequences of becoming entangled in a federal racketeering investigation. He saw the cold, hard data I had placed in front of him, and he instantly recognized the absolute truth. The venture capitalist slowly closed the manila folder. He looked at Jamal with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not ask for an explanation, and he did not wait to hear another pathetic lie. He simply stood up, tossed a $50 bill onto the table to cover his drink, and walked away without uttering a single word. He left them sitting there completely exposed and entirely ruined. The moment the investor disappeared through the restaurant doors, Audrey completely lost her mind. The fragile, glamorous facade she had worn all evening violently shattered into a million jagged pieces. She slumped forward onto the dining table, burying her face in her hands, and began screaming and crying hysterically. Her loud, agonizing sobs echoed through the upscale dining room, drawing the horrified stares of every single patron around us. She wailed that I had ruined her life, her marriage, and her entire future. She pounded her fists against the table, a grown woman throwing a devastating temper tantrum because her stolen financial lifeline had just been incinerated before her very eyes. Jamal sat frozen in his seat, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his failure. The arrogant, slick-talking broker had been entirely stripped of his power. He stared at the spot where the investor had just been sitting, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths, as the terrifying reality of his impending federal prison sentence finally crashed down upon him. He had tried to outsmart a forensic accountant, and it had cost him his absolute last chance at survival. I looked down at my weeping sister and her broken husband, feeling nothing but a profound, chilling sense of satisfaction. I did not offer a single word of sympathy or closure. I simply picked up my empty briefcase, turned my back on their public meltdown, and walked out of the restaurant with my head held high, leaving them to their absolute total misery. I knew their desperation would now mutate into something far more dangerous, and I was completely prepared for the retaliation that was bound to follow as I headed toward my office parking garage. The financial district was mostly deserted at this late hour, the towering skyscrapers casting long, imposing shadows across the empty concrete sidewalks. I swiped my secure corporate security badge at the designated side entrance of my building, deliberately bypassing the main lobby to access the subterranean parking levels directly. The heavy metal security door clicked shut behind me, instantly plunging me into the harsh, flickering fluorescent lighting of the underground structure. The air down here was always thick with the distinct smell of motor oil, damp concrete, and lingering exhaust fumes. My footsteps echoed sharply against the painted cinder block walls as I methodically navigated the maze of gray support pillars, making my way toward my designated parking spot on the third sublevel. I kept my posture relaxed, but intensely vigilant, my analytical senses fully attuned to the echoing, unnatural silence of the massive vacant structure. As I turned the final corner toward my parked vehicle, a tall, imposing figure stepped out from the deep shadows behind a concrete support column, deliberately blocking my direct path to the driver's side door. It was Jamal, the slick, arrogant real estate broker I had just dismantled at the upscale restaurant was entirely gone. In his place stood a frantic, highly erratic man who had been pushed to the absolute brink of total collapse. His expensive navy suit was heavily rumpled, his silk tie had been violently yanked loose, and his chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The sheer, unadulterated panic in his wide eyes was highly palpable. He had managed to track my specific location, likely waiting in the freezing subterranean garage for over an hour, just to orchestrate this cowardly ambush. He stepped forward aggressively, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me, invading my personal space in a pathetic, desperate attempt to reassert his shattered dominance. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him, completely unfazed by his hostile posturing. I did not flinch, I did not back away, and I certainly did not reach for my phone to call the building security team. I simply stood there, firmly gripping the sturdy handle of my leather briefcase, waiting patiently for him to play his final miserable hand. Jamal immediately launched into a furious, unhinged tirade. He aggressively pointed his trembling finger at my face, claiming that my calculated actions at the restaurant had just destroyed his entire life and permanently ruined his marriage to my sister Audrey. He loudly stated that the targeted venture capitalist had been his absolute last financial lifeline to avoid total annihilation, and my stunt had guaranteed his impending commercial bankruptcy. He ranted endlessly about how incredibly hard he had worked to build his public image, completely ignoring the massive, glaring fact that his entire real estate empire was constructed entirely on top of my stolen identity and federal bank fraud. He demanded to know why I could not just let things go, desperately falling back on the same toxic, manipulative family rhetoric that my father had attempted to use at the police station. He expected me to show some kind of deep remorse, overwhelming guilt, or basic human fear. But I maintained a steady, icy gaze, refusing to give him a single ounce of the emotional reaction he so desperately craved. My absolute, unwavering silence only fueled his erratic, nervous behavior. He began pacing back and forth in the narrow space between the parked cars, his movements sharp and highly unpredictable. He declared forcefully that he was not going down without a vicious fight, and that if I was so eager to ruin his professional life, he was fully prepared to obliterate mine. He abruptly stopped pacing, reached deep into his wrinkled suit jacket, and pulled out his smartphone. He held the digital device up in the air like it was a loaded weapon, a triumphant, malicious sneer finally breaking through his previously panicked expression. He informed me that while I might be a brilliant forensic accountant, he knew exactly how to play the corporate warfare game just as ruthlessly as I did. He tapped the glowing screen and pressed play on an audio file. The sound of my own voice suddenly echoed through the damp, quiet parking garage. But the words coming out of the small phone speaker were entirely fabricated. It was a spliced, highly edited digital recording, roughly assembled from various heated family arguments we had engaged in over the past 5 years. Jamal had clearly used cheap basic audio manipulation software to chop together different sentences, maliciously removing all original context to create a completely damning, fictional narrative. The doctored audio made it sound exactly as if I were bitterly confessing to fabricating the extensive financial evidence against him out of pure, deep-seated jealousy over his supposedly perfect marriage to my golden child sister. The fake recording featured my manipulated voice, seemingly admitting that the federal dossier was nothing more than a malicious, calculated setup specifically designed to destroy the favorite members of the family. Jamal paused the recording, his chest puffed out with arrogant satisfaction. He looked at me thoroughly convinced he had just secured the ultimate leverage needed to force my complete compliance. He launched into his blackmail demands, laying out a highly specific, desperate ultimatum. He knew exactly how incredibly strict the National Accounting Ethics Board was regarding professional integrity and alleged personal vendettas. I threatened to email that manipulated audio file directly to the senior partners at my corporate firm, the State Licensing Board, and the lead federal prosecutor currently assigned to his active fraud case. He confidently claimed that the recording would cast enough reasonable doubt on my personal credibility to completely tank the federal investigation and trigger the immediate permanent revocation of my certified public accountant license. He gave me a strict, non-negotiable deadline of 8 o'clock the next morning. He explicitly demanded that I march directly into the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office, officially recant my entire testimony, and sign a sworn legal statement claiming that my initial identity theft report was a massive, unfortunate administrative error on my part. If I refused to comply with his demands, he promised to hit send on the malicious email, ensuring my lucrative corporate career was permanently destroyed before lunch. I stood perfectly still, analytically processing the crude digital forgery I had just been forced to listen to, as a professional who spent countless hours analyzing data integrity. The audio file was an absolute joke. I could easily hear the unnatural shifts in the background ambient noise, the abrupt clipping of the syllables, and the jagged transitions where my sentences had been awkwardly mashed together. It was a sloppy, desperate amateur job that any forensic audio specialist would easily debunk within 5 minutes of basic digital analysis. But Jamal was not a technical expert. He was just a cornered, terrified fraudster grasping at straws. He truly believed this pathetic attempt at extortion was his ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. He smirked at me, expecting me to crumble under the heavy weight of his corporate threats, anticipating the moment I would finally beg for a compromise. He wanted me to experience the exact same suffocating panic he had felt when the venture capitalist walked away from the dinner table just hours ago. Instead of showing fear, I simply tilted my head and stared at him with an expression of profound clinical pity. I did not attempt to snatch the phone from his trembling hands, and I did not bother trying to explain the blatant technical flaws in his heavily doctored recording. I recognized that engaging with his delusional blackmail scheme would only validate his false sense of authority. He had pushed himself into absolute desperation, cornering me in a dimly lit parking garage late at night because he had absolutely no legitimate legal defense left to play. He was relying on pure intimidation, assuming my professional career was the only thing I valued, and that the mere threat of a corporate scandal would force me into immediate submission. I was completely oblivious to the fact that I had already secured the unwavering support of my senior partners, and that a fake audio file would do nothing but add a secondary federal charge of extortion to his rapidly growing criminal indictment. I tightened my grip on my briefcase, maintaining my absolutely impenetrable composure. The stark contrast between his frantic, sweating desperation and my freezing, absolute calm clearly began to unnerve him. I did not utter a single word of protest or compliance. I simply stood my ground, calculating my exact next move, fully preparing to drop the final devastating revelation that would eradicate his pathetic attempt at blackmail and obliterate his entire world from the inside out. I watched Jamal stand under the flickering fluorescent lights of the parking garage, his chest puffed out with the delusion that he had just outsmarted me. He held his phone like a loaded weapon, waiting for me to fall to my knees and beg him not to ruin my corporate career. The silence between us stretched for a long, heavy moment before I finally broke it. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not negotiate. I simply looked at his sweating face and told him that his desperate attempt at extortion was the most pathetic thing I had ever witnessed. I explained, speaking slowly so he could absorb every single syllable, that digital audio forensics would dismantle his crude forgery in less than 10 minutes. I informed him that sending a fabricated recording to the federal prosecutor would not save him from prison, but it would hand the government a pristine, indisputable charge of witness tampering and blackmail to add to his already massive indictment. The triumphant smirk on his face began to waver, replaced by a fresh wave of creeping panic, as my absolute lack of fear derailed his entire strategy. He tried to interrupt me aggressively, insisting that the corporate ethics board would suspend my license the second the email hit their inbox, regardless of whether the audio was real or fake. I stepped 1 foot closer to him, closing the physical distance to assert total control over the conversation. I told him he was entirely missing the point. My career was already bulletproof, protected by the senior partners who had seen through his transparent smear campaign earlier that very morning. But more importantly, I needed him to understand that while he was busy playing amateur audio editor in his car, I had been continuing my professional investigation into his shattered real estate firm. I kept my eyes locked on his as I calmly informed him that I already knew all about his hidden offshore accounts. The moment the word offshore left my mouth, the remaining color completely drained from Jamal's face. His hand holding the phone slowly dropped to his side. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another frantic lie, but the sheer shock had paralyzed his vocal cords. I had believed those accounts were untraceable, buried beneath layers of shell companies and fake vendor invoices. He had severely underestimated the capabilities of a 30-year-old forensic accountant who had been given unrestricted access to institutional financial tracking software. I did not let him recover. I leaned into the devastating silence and began listing off the exact routing numbers, the offshore bank locations, and the precise dollar amounts sitting in those hidden accounts. I watched his breathing turn shallow and erratic as I systematically tore down the final walls of his financial fortress. I explained that tracing the money he had stolen using my social security number was incredibly easy, but the real fascinating discovery came when I followed the secondary pipeline of cash flowing out of his supposedly legitimate business accounts. I kept my tone entirely conversational, almost polite, as I delivered the crushing blow. I revealed that during my deep dive into his financial architecture, I discovered that he had not just been stealing from me. I told him that I had accessed the complete unredacted transaction logs for my mother and my sister. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror as I stated the exact devastating truth. He had completely systematically drained Patricia's entire retirement fund. Every single dollar my mother had saved for her future had been quietly siphoned away through fraudulent investment authorizations that Jamal had executed under her nose. But I was not finished. I watched him physically tremble as I moved on to his perfect golden wife. I informed him that I also knew he had completely hollowed out Audrey's joint savings accounts, the massive safety net my sister thought she possessed. The money she constantly used to justify her arrogant, condescending attitude toward my practical lifestyle was entirely gone. Jamal had left his own wife absolutely destitute, transferring her life savings into his untraceable offshore pipeline to hide the money before the federal investigators could freeze his domestic assets. Jamal backed up against the concrete pillar, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The man who had strutted into an upscale restaurant just hours ago, bragging about his wealth and demanding respect, was now reduced to a terrified, cornered animal. He tried to stammer out an explanation, weakly claiming that he was just moving the funds temporarily to protect the family assets from the impending federal seizures, and that he was going to put it all back once the heat died down. I let out a short, hollow laugh that echoed sharply against the cinder-block walls of the underground garage. I told him that was a fascinating excuse, but the spending data painted a vastly different picture. I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my own smartphone. I unlocked the screen and held it up, displaying a heavily encrypted, highly detailed financial dossier I had compiled over the past 24 hours. I told Jamal that I knew exactly where all that stolen family money was actually going, and it was not sitting safely in an offshore holding account, waiting for the storm to pass. I kept my voice perfectly steady as I verbally outlined his secret lavish second life. I detailed the luxury beachfront condominium he had recently leased in Miami. I listed the exact dates and purchase amounts for the extravagant diamond jewelry and the expensive designer handbags he had bought over the past 6 months. And then I delivered the ultimate kill shot. I stated the full legal name of the mistress he had been hiding in that Miami condo. Jamal looked as if the concrete floor had just dropped out from underneath him. The sheer terror in his eyes was absolute. He had assumed that his federal fraud charges were the worst problem he was facing, completely ignorant to the fact that I had just uncovered the ultimate unforgivable betrayal that would destroy his marriage from the inside out. He had stolen from the two most vicious image-obsessed women on the planet just to finance a secret affair. I knew that the federal government might send him to prison, but Patricia and Audrey would absolutely tear him to shreds the second they realized they were broke and betrayed. He suddenly lunged forward, throwing his hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged me to keep my voice down, frantically promising that he would delete the fake audio recording right now if I just kept the Miami information to myself. He pleaded with me, swearing he would confess to the federal prosecutors, sign whatever documents I wanted, and take the full blame for the identity theft if I just gave him 48 hours to sort out the missing funds. I was sweating profusely, his expensive suit clinging to his shaking frame as he offered me anything and everything to maintain his toxic secret. I looked at the man who had stolen my identity, ruined my credit, and stood by while my family treated me like garbage. I felt absolutely no pity for the absolute ruin he had brought upon himself. I looked down at my phone screen, my thumb hovering directly over the send button on my email application. I calmly informed Jamal that I had zero interest in negotiating with a cornered rat. I told him that I did not need his fake confession to win my federal case, and I certainly did not need his permission to protect my own life. I looked him dead in the eye and stated that my sister deserved to know exactly what kind of man she had been boasting about at that Mother's Day dinner. Without breaking eye contact, I pressed the button on my screen. I watched the confirmation banner pop up, verifying that the encrypted email had just been successfully delivered. I lowered my phone and casually slipped it back into my jacket pocket. I told Jamal that a comprehensive, fully documented report detailing his offshore accounts, his drained family funds, and high-definition photographs of his Miami mistress had just been forwarded directly to Audrey's personal inbox. I added that I had copied Patricia on the email as well, just to ensure the message was received loudly and clearly. Jamal let out a strangled, agonizing gasp, grabbing the sides of his head as the reality of his total destruction finally set in. He knew that Audrey was likely sitting in their suburban home right now, frantically refreshing her phone, waiting for him to return with a solution to their financial crisis. Instead, she was about to open an email that would absolutely obliterate her reality. I told him to enjoy the incoming explosive domestic fallout. I turned my back on Jamal and walked toward my vehicle, leaving him gasping for air in the damp parking garage. I slipped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and navigated out of the subterranean structure into the vibrant city lights of Chicago. I did not need to physically stand in my sister's luxurious suburban living room to witness the absolute devastation that was currently unfolding. The digital trap I had meticulously set was designed to detonate with absolute precision, and the blast radius was inescapable. As I merged onto the highway, my dashboard console lit up with an incoming call from Audrey. I did not answer. Instead, I let it go straight to voicemail, allowing her incoming messages to serve as a real-time audio documentary of her completely shattered reality. Over the next 2 hours, Audrey left 7 frantic voicemails. The evolution of her tone perfectly mirrored the catastrophic collapse of her fabricated life. The first message was a high-pitched, aggressive demand. She screamed that I had sent her a malicious photoshopped file insisting that Jamal was a devoted husband who would never touch another woman, let alone drain their accounts. She called me a pathetic liar, desperately clinging to the illusion of her flawless marriage. But the forensic evidence I had forwarded was far too comprehensive to be dismissed. I had provided the exact routing numbers, the signed commercial lease agreement for the luxury condominium in Miami, and crystal clear surveillance stills of Jamal with his secret mistress. I had included the verified banking logs showing the precise dates and times Jamal had siphoned the funds directly from Audrey's joint savings and Patricia's retirement portfolio. By the third voicemail, Audrey's aggressive denial had entirely evaporated, replaced by raw, guttural sobbing. The background noise of the recording painted a chaotic, violent picture. I could hear the distinct sound of glass shattering against a wall and Audrey screaming at the top of her lungs. Jamal had finally arrived at their suburban mansion, likely hoping he could spin one last desperate lie to control the narrative. But there is absolutely no defense against undeniable financial data. Audrey confronted him with the encrypted dossier, holding the undeniable proof of his staggering betrayal right in his face. The man she had constantly paraded in front of me as the ultimate symbol of wealth and success was suddenly exposed as a parasitic fraudster who had systematically robbed her blind to finance a secret, lavish second life. The illusion of their perfect marriage violently disintegrated in the middle of their expensive living room. Audrey wailed that she had defended him to the authorities, that she had publicly humiliated herself on social media to beg for his legal defense funds, only to discover he was funneling that exact same money to another woman in Florida. She demanded to know where her life savings had gone. She demanded to know how he could completely drain our mother's retirement accounts while simultaneously smiling at family dinners. The fourth voicemail was nothing but the sound of pure domestic warfare. I listened with a chilling sense of absolute detachment as Jamal dropped his slick persona entirely. Cornered, exposed, and stripped of his power, he stopped apologizing and started viciously lashing out. He yelled that Audrey was a foolish, high-maintenance burden who cared more about designer handbags than actual business strategy. He cruelly threw her vanity back in her face, admitting that he only married into our family because my mother was incredibly easy to manipulate and their collective obsession with social status made them perfect targets. The absolute cruelty of his words struck Audrey with the force of a freight train. For her entire 27 years of life, Audrey had been the undisputed golden child, shielded from every consequence and elevated onto an untouchable pedestal. Now the man she had tied her entire identity to was explicitly telling her that she was nothing more than a convenient, pathetic mark. The psychological devastation was absolute. Jamal knew exactly what he was doing. He was intentionally burning the bridge because he knew he had absolutely no avenue left for survival. He was currently staring down the barrel of a massive federal racketeering indictment, a multi-million-dollar bank fraud case, and now an incredibly hostile divorce that would leave him with absolutely no marital assets to leverage. Realizing that the federal prosecutors were closing in and his domestic safety net was completely obliterated, Jamal made the only move a cowardly predator knows how to make. He decided to flee the state. My proprietary financial tracking software immediately flagged a series of desperate transactions. I sat at my kitchen island watching my secure tablet as the alerts rolled in. Jamal could not access traditional banking channels because of the federal asset freeze orders I had initiated, so he resorted to emptying whatever petty cash the family had left hidden in their physical possession. He cracked open the small floor safe in their master bedroom, stealing the emergency cash reserves and maxing out the few remaining personal credit cards that had not yet been flagged. He abandoned Audrey in the middle of her hysterical breakdown, packed a single duffel bag, and sprinted out the front door, leaving his completely ruined life behind. The sudden chaotic departure of Jamal sent the already fragile family structure into a total irreversible freefall. The final three voicemails from Audrey were no longer angry or accusatory. They were the sounds of a woman who had just realized she was entirely destitute. She wept into the phone, stating that Jamal had taken her last remaining debit card and the keys to their only unseized vehicle. She was trapped in a massive, heavily mortgaged suburban mansion with absolutely zero income, zero savings, and a mountain of impending legal debt. The luxury lifestyle she had endlessly used to mock my practical independent choices was officially dead, replaced by the terrifying reality of imminent foreclosure and absolute poverty. But Audrey was not the only one left to face the catastrophic wreckage. The fallout instantly consumed my mother as well. Patricia had staked her entire social reputation and her personal freedom on Jamal's fabricated innocence. She had aggressively drained her remaining liquid assets to secure his initial bail, fully believing they would present a united front against my federal complaint. Now, with Jamal actively fleeing the state and triggering a massive federal manhunt, Patricia was left completely isolated. She was the sole remaining target for the federal prosecutors because she had actively participated in falsifying income verification documents and had allowed Jamal to use her accounts to launder the stolen identity funds. She was legally tethered to his crimes. With the primary orchestrator missing, the federal government would focus the entirety of their absolute wrath directly onto her. Patricia was forced to face the incoming federal fraud charges entirely alone without a single dollar to hire a competent defense attorney. I turned off my phone, cutting off the endless stream of Audrey's desperate sobbing. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for the devastation sweeping through their lives. I had not forced Jamal to steal my identity. I had not forced him to drain their accounts, and I had certainly not forced him to finance a secret mistress. I simply turned on the lights and forced them to look at the rotting truth they had actively chosen to ignore. They had built their entire reality on a foundation of greed, manipulation, and profound cruelty. When that foundation inevitably collapsed under the weight of hard forensic evidence, the destruction was entirely of their own making. I walked over to the windows of my high-rise apartment and looked out over the glittering city lights. My career was thriving, my finances were secure, and my professional reputation was bulletproof. I had successfully excised the toxic tumor that had plagued my entire existence. The golden child was now a penniless, abandoned wife, facing the brutal reality of an empty bank account. The narcissistic mother was an isolated, terrified suspect, waiting for the federal justice system to drop the final hammer. And the arrogant, deceitful brother-in-law was a desperate fugitive running from a federal manhunt that he could never possibly win. The family civil war had concluded with maximum casualties on their side. They had aggressively demanded my absolute destruction to preserve their hollow illusion, fully expecting me to quietly absorb the damage, just like I had always done. But I had refused to play the role of the compliant victim. I had weaponized my truth, utilizing the exact same financial systems they had tried to use against me, and I had watched their entire world detonate from the inside out. I closed the blinds, stepping away from the window with a profound sense of closure. I knew their desperation would soon force them to seek a new target for survival, and I was prepared to shut down whatever pathetic attempt at reconciliation they dared to try next. The financial detonation I engineered left absolute silence in its wake for exactly 4 days. Jamal was a desperate fugitive running from federal agents, and Patricia was sitting in a cold holding cell facing an insurmountable wall of wire fraud charges. My life, however, returned to its highly organized, impeccably quiet routine. I spent my days at my corporate firm uncovering other people's financial deceits, and my evenings enjoying the pristine sanctuary of my high-security downtown apartment. I assumed the absolute devastation of their domestic reality would keep my family entirely occupied. I severely underestimated the sheer terrifying audacity of a golden child who had just lost her endless supply of stolen funding. It was a Thursday evening, raining with that bitter, biting chill unique to Chicago. I had just swiped my electronic key fob to open the heavy glass doors of my residential building lobby. The complex boasts top-tier security, 24-hour concierge service, and strict access protocols designed specifically to keep unwanted elements out on the street. As I stepped toward the marble reception desk to collect my mail, a frantic, disheveled figure lunged out from the dark alcove near the exterior planter boxes, deliberately wedging herself between the heavy door and the locking mechanism before it could completely close. It was Audrey. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hand gripping my leather briefcase. I almost did not recognize my own sister. The stunning, impeccably groomed socialite, who had sneered at me from across a private dining room just a few days ago, was completely gone. In her place stood a ragged, soaked, and utterly desperate woman. Her expensive blonde hair was plastered to the sides of her face by the freezing rain. She was wearing a trench coat that looked as though she had slept in it for 3 days straight, and her eyes were heavily bloodshot, circled by dark, exhausted shadows. The arrogant, condescending smirk that had defined her entire existence had been entirely erased by the brutal reality of absolute poverty. She had somehow managed to bypass the outer security gate by tailgating a delivery worker, waiting in the freezing downpour for hours, just to ambush me. The concierge immediately stood up, his hand hovering over the security panic button, asking if he needed to call the police to have the trespassing individual removed from the premises. I raised my hand, signaling the guard to wait. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of delusion she had brought to my doorstep. Audrey stumbled forward, her knees visibly shaking, and immediately broke down into loud, ugly, hyperventilating tears. She stood dripping wet on the pristine marble floor of my lobby, sobbing so aggressively that her words initially morphed into a pathetic, incomprehensible string of whimpers. She begged me to give her just 5 minutes of my time, completely ignoring the fact that she was tracking muddy water across the immaculate lobby floor. She wailed that Jamal had taken absolutely everything when he fled the state. She confirmed what my financial tracking had already shown. He had emptied the physical safe, maxed out the remaining credit cards, and abandoned her in a massive, heavily mortgaged suburban mansion with absolutely zero cash flow. She sobbed that the bank had already served her with an imminent foreclosure notice because the mortgage payments Jamal had supposedly been making for the past 6 months had bounced. She cried that her electricity was going to be shut off by Monday, and that she could not even afford to buy basic groceries. She detailed the absolute humiliation of having her luxury sport utility vehicle repossessed right out of her driveway, while her judgmental neighbors watched from their manicured lawns. She wept that her entire social circle had instantly abandoned her the moment the news of the federal raid hit the local gossip channels. Her wealthy friends, the same people who had happily attended her lavish dinner parties, funded by my stolen identity, were now refusing to answer her calls or return her desperate text messages. She was completely isolated, stripped of her stolen wealth, and forced to face the horrifying reality of her own incompetence. Then came the true purpose of her desperate ambush. She wiped her running nose on the sleeve of her expensive ruined coat and begged me for a massive cash loan. She demanded $50,000 in unmarked, untraceable cash. She claimed she desperately needed the money to hire a high-powered divorce attorney to legally separate herself from Jamal's federal crimes and to pay the immediate bank arrears to save her house. She promised she would pay me back every single cent, offering completely empty assurances from a woman who had never worked a legitimate job in her entire adult life. When I simply stared at her without offering a single word of comfort, she immediately pivoted to the ultimate toxic family defense. She tried to grab my arm, insisting that we were still blood and that sisters were supposed to support each other during catastrophic tragedies. She wept that our mother was locked away, her husband was a fugitive, and I was the absolute only safety net she had left in the entire world. She attempted to weaponize our shared childhood, bringing up fabricated memories of sisterly bonding to force me into a state of emotional compliance. She cried that she had always looked up to me and that she never meant to hurt me completely, rewriting the history of her lifelong systematic psychological abuse. I looked down at her shaking, desperate form, feeling an absolute clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the woman who had spent decades actively destroying my self-esteem for her own amusement. I pulled my arm back, completely rejecting her attempt at physical contact. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered my response with the precise, freezing calculation of a forensic auditor shutting down a bankrupt account. I reminded her of the Mother's Day dinner. I specifically recalled the exact moment she had flashed her diamond tennis necklace, laughing as she mocked my practical lifestyle, calling me a glorified calculator who would never understand true luxury. I repeated her exact words back to her, reminding her how she had proudly stated that we were completely out of each other's leagues and that my peasant lifestyle was an embarrassment to her refined social standing. I told her that she was absolutely correct about one thing. We were not in the same league. I built my life on hard work, massive dedication, and uncompromising financial integrity, while her entire existence was funded by my stolen social security number and the exploitation of a federal banking system. I clearly stated that I was not her personal bank, I was not her emergency safety net, and I was absolutely not her sister anymore. I continued my systematic dismantling of her delusions, ensuring that my words left absolutely no room for interpretation or future negotiation. I coldly suggested that since she had spent her entire life relying on her high-class charm, her expensive wardrobe, and her golden child status to get exactly what she wanted from our enabling parents, she should try taking that exact same charm down to the bank manager to see if it would cover her foreclosure notice. I advised her to take whatever scraps of designer clothing she had left, walk into a pawn shop, and learn what it actually means to survive in the real world without a stolen safety net to break her fall. I made it abundantly clear that any familial bond she thought we possessed had been permanently severed the second she smiled while my mother wished I had never been born. Audrey gasped, her mouth falling open in sheer paralyzed horror as the absolute finality of my words struck her. She realized in that exact moment that her tears held absolutely zero currency with me, and that her lifelong manipulation tactics were completely useless against the iron boundary I had constructed. I turned to the concierge, firmly instructed him to permanently ban her from the premises under threat of legal action, and walked toward the private elevator without looking back. I left Audrey sobbing uncontrollably on the polished marble floor, the heavy security doors sealing her out of my life forever. I stepped into the glass elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse level, watching her pathetic, shrinking figure disappear as I rose higher into the city skyline. I entered my quiet apartment, pouring myself a glass of expensive wine, relishing the absolute silence that now defined my protected environment. The golden child had finally fallen from her unearned pedestal, crashing into the devastating reality she had actively helped build. With my mother locked in federal custody and my sister completely destitute, I was fully aware that my father was the only one left to make a desperate, calculating move. The federal trial was looming just 3 weeks away, casting a massive, inescapable shadow over whatever remained of his shattered social reputation. The prosecution was finalizing their witness lists, and my comprehensive forensic dossier was the undisputed crown jewel of their entire case against Patricia. Richard had spent my entire life functioning as the quiet, passive enabler who allowed his wife and golden daughter to inflict endless psychological damage without ever getting his own hands dirty. But with his extravagant lifestyle actively collapsing and his wife facing a severe, lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary, his cowardly passivity was no longer a viable survival strategy. I knew he was quietly watching the absolute destruction of his family from the sidelines, methodically analyzing the wreckage to determine if there was any possible way to salvage his own freedom and comfort. My confirmation arrived on a bleak, overcast Tuesday morning in the form of a highly unusual hand-delivered courier envelope at my corporate office. Richard did not dare risk a phone call or a digital message that could be intercepted or easily recorded by federal authorities. Instead, he sent a formal typed letter requesting an urgent, strictly private meeting at an obscure independent coffee shop located in a working-class neighborhood miles away from the financial district. It was an establishment completely removed from the high society country clubs and luxury dining rooms he usually frequented. It was a cold, neutral, heavily disguised battleground. I accepted the invitation, fully understanding that I was walking into the ultimate psychological trap, prepared to face the man who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of quiet, devastating manipulation. I arrived at the designated location exactly 10 minutes early, securing a corner booth that provided a clear, unobstructed view of the entrance and the surrounding street. The coffee shop was incredibly dim, filled with the loud hissing sounds of espresso machines and the low, anonymous chatter of patrons who had absolutely no interest in our impending domestic warfare. Richard walked through the front door precisely at the agreed time, and the sheer visual transformation he had orchestrated was genuinely staggering. The man who typically wore immaculate custom-tailored suits and projected an aura of untouchable arrogant wealth had intentionally dressed down to play the role of a thoroughly broken, devastated patriarch. His posture was heavily slumped, his shoulders bowed under the fabricated weight of his family's total annihilation. He wore a slightly wrinkled, unremarkable gray sweater, and his usually perfectly styled hair was deliberately disheveled. He scanned the crowded room, his eyes carrying a practiced, hollow expression of profound grief, until he finally spotted me sitting in the shadows. He slowly shuffled over to the booth, sliding into the worn vinyl seat across from me, with a heavy theatrical sigh that was meant to immediately elicit my deepest sympathies. I did not offer a greeting, nor did I ask how he was holding up under the immense pressure of the federal investigation. I simply sat there, my posture completely rigid, and my expression entirely devoid of any warmth, waiting for him to launch into whatever elaborate manipulative performance he had spent the last few days constructing. Richard began his performance with a masterful display of manufactured emotional vulnerability. He leaned heavily across the small, sticky table, lowering his voice into a trembling conspiratorial whisper designed to project absolute desperation. He launched into a lengthy, agonizing monologue about the complete obliteration of their family legacy, painting a highly distressing picture of the current reality they were facing. He described the unbearable humiliation of having their assets publicly scrutinized, the sheer terror Patricia was experiencing while locked inside a cold, unforgiving federal holding cell, and the absolute destitution that had recently consumed my sister. He aggressively attempted to leverage the very concept of biological loyalty, shamelessly invoking memories of my childhood, to force a sense of foundational guilt onto my shoulders. He conveniently bypassed the glaring, undeniable fact that his wife had publicly disowned me in a crowded restaurant just weeks prior, entirely ignoring the systematic financial exploitation they had all willingly participated in. He framed the entire federal indictment not as a direct consequence of their own massive calculated fraud, but as a tragic, uncontrollable disaster that had unfairly descended upon their innocent household. He spoke with the agonizing cadence of a loving father who was merely trying to shield his fractured family from total annihilation. I listened to his entire agonizing speech without breaking eye contact or showing a single ounce of emotional compliance. My professional training allowed me to view his entire monologue as a fascinating, desperate data set. I cataloged every micro-expression, every forced quiver in his voice, and every calculated pause, waiting patiently for the inevitable transaction that I knew was hiding just beneath his tragic broken facade. When he finally realized that his elaborate emotional guilt trip was entirely failing to penetrate my iron boundaries, Richard abruptly shifted his strategy from psychological manipulation to direct criminal negotiation. He reached a trembling hand deep into the inner pocket of his wrinkled sweater and slowly withdrew a crisp, stark white envelope. He placed it carefully onto the table between us, sliding it across the surface with agonizing, deliberate slowness until it rested exactly inches from my hands. He kept his eyes locked on mine as I reached out, broke the seal, and withdrew the document hidden inside. It was a certified cashier's check officially issued by a prominent regional bank and made out explicitly to my full legal name. My eyes immediately locked onto the numeric value printed clearly across the center of the secure paper. The amount was a staggering $200,000. Richard leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a barely audible, intensely urgent frequency as he laid out the explicit, highly illegal terms of his proposition. He explicitly begged me to take the massive sum of money, immediately resign from my corporate position, and flee the state entirely. He demanded that I completely vanish into the shadows, intentionally skipping my highly anticipated subpoenaed testimony at the upcoming federal fraud trial. He desperately needed me to become an untraceable ghost, guaranteeing that the prosecution's star witness and primary financial whistleblower would be completely unavailable to verify the evidence. He was actively attempting to bribe me into committing severe federal witness tampering to ensure Patricia would walk completely free. To ensure I accepted this massive, highly illegal bribe, Richard immediately proceeded to construct a deeply heartbreaking, meticulously detailed narrative regarding the sheer origin of the funds. He desperately wanted me to believe that this money represented his ultimate selfless sacrifice as a devoted father. He detailed the immense, agonizing hurdles he allegedly faced trying to gather such a massive amount of liquid cash while the federal government was actively freezing and monitoring their standard banking accounts. He tearfully claimed that he had been forced to quietly and urgently sell off his most prized beloved possession, a meticulously restored, highly valuable vintage sports car that he had obsessively maintained for over 2 decades. He added a tragic, dramatic layer to the lie by claiming he had also completely liquidated his entire long-standing life insurance policy, effectively destroying his own future financial security, just to scrape together this final desperate offering. He looked at me with red, tear-filled eyes, framing the $200,000 check, not as a malicious act of criminal bribery, but as a pure, selfless gift from a completely broken man who had sacrificed absolutely everything he had left in the world just to save his fractured family from total incarceration. He expected me to be utterly overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of his supposed personal losses, anticipating that my lingering, deeply buried desire for parental validation would finally override my fierce, unyielding commitment to the objective truth. I stared at the crisp check in my hands, my forensic accountant instincts immediately kicking into massive overdrive. A man whose portfolio was actively locked down by aggressive federal asset freeze orders does not simply manifest $200,000 in clean funds without triggering regulatory alarms. The financial math failed to align, and his tragic story regarding the vintage car and the liquidated life insurance policy felt incredibly hollow and rehearsed. I did not throw the fraudulent check back across the table. I did not verbally agree to his illegal terms, nor did I explicitly refuse them. Instead, I smoothly folded the expensive paper, slid it securely into my leather briefcase, and stood up from the booth. I left him sitting alone at the table, projecting an aura of quiet contemplation, while internally I was already preparing to trace every single routing number on that piece of paper to uncover his ultimate fatal secret. I returned to the absolute sanctuary of my downtown apartment, the heavy security door locking behind me with a reassuring click. I walked straight to my home office, bypassing the kitchen entirely, and placed the crisp cashier check onto the center of my glass desk. Richard had genuinely believed his tearful performance at the coffee shop was a masterclass in paternal manipulation. He had banked his entire strategy on the assumption that a $200,000 bribe would be enough to trigger a sudden wave of daughterly compliance, buying my permanent absence from the upcoming federal trial. He expected me to cash the check, pack my bags, and disappear into the shadows, leaving my mother to evade justice. What he failed to comprehend was that handing a certified bank document to a senior forensic accountant is the exact equivalent of handing a loaded weapon to an executioner. I booted up my encrypted terminal, authenticating my access to the high-level financial tracking databases my firm utilized for corporate fraud investigations. I did not need to guess where Richard had supposedly procured the funds. I had the precise routing and account numbers printed cleanly across the bottom of the bribe he had just handed me. I typed the 9-digit sequence into the search interface and initiated a deep trace. Richard claimed he had liquidated a prized vintage car and drained his life insurance policy to scrape this money together. But as the data began populating across my monitors, that pathetic fabricated narrative instantly disintegrated. The funds had not originated from an auto auction or an insurance disbursement. They had been transferred directly from an obscure high-yield wealth management account held at a private bank in Delaware. I isolated the Delaware account and executed a secondary query, forcing the system to pull the original establishment documents and the historical ledger of all incoming and outgoing transactions. The progress bar flashed across the screen, parsing through decades of digital archives. When the Genesis document finally rendered in high definition, the air completely left my lungs. The account was not a secret investment portfolio built by my father. It was an irrevocable trust fund. I scanned the establishing signatures, reading the clear, distinct handwriting of my late maternal grandmother. She had passed away 12 years ago, long before I ever had the chance to understand the true depth of my family's toxicity. According to the legal parameters explicitly detailed in the founding charter, the trust was established for one singular purpose. It was left exclusively to me. My grandmother had intentionally bypassed my mother entirely, likely recognizing the exact same greed and manipulation that I had spent my entire life enduring. The trust was designed to mature and transfer into my full legal possession on my 18th birthday, providing me with an absolute financial safety net. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding with a dangerous, icy rhythm as I pulled up the withdrawal authorization forms. The digital records showed that exactly 3 weeks after my 18th birthday, the trust had been successfully accessed and unlocked. I pulled the scanned PDF of the release form and zoomed in on the bottom of the page. There, sitting starkly against the white background, was my own signature. It was a flawless, highly practiced forgery. Richard and Patricia had intercepted the legal notifications from the Delaware bank. They had hidden the existence of the trust from me entirely, forged my signature to gain administrative control over the assets, and quietly redirected the massive compounding fortune into a shadow account under their joint control. I spent the next 2 hours analyzing the decade-long ledger of systemic calculated theft. I watched the flow of my stolen inheritance, mapping directly to the timeline of my family's extravagant lifestyle. While I had been working double shifts to pay my own way through college, my parents had been siphoning thousands of dollars a month from my grandmother's trust to pay for Audrey's luxury vacations, her designer wardrobe, and the down payment on her first upscale condominium. They had aggressively bankrolled the golden child, using the exact funds that had been legally and morally intended to secure my future. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the betrayal was staggering, but the ultimate sickening irony was sitting right there on my glass desk. Richard had not just stolen my inheritance to fund his favorite daughter. When his wife was facing federal prison and his fraudulent son-in-law had fled the state, Richard had gone back to the very well he had been quietly draining for over a decade. He had withdrawn $200,000 of my own stolen money, printed it on a cashier check, and tried to use it to bribe me into dropping the federal charges against Patricia. He was trying to buy my silence using my own grandmother's dying gift. A different woman might have broken down crying at the sheer magnitude of the deception. A weaker daughter might have felt overwhelmed by the realization that her own parents had been plotting against her financial existence since she was a teenager. I did not shed a single tear. I felt a cold, hyper-focused surge of pure adrenaline flood my system. Richard had spent his entire life playing the role of the passive, innocent bystander who just wanted peace in the family. He had let Patricia and Audrey take the spotlight for their vicious cruelty, keeping his own hands seemingly clean. But this paper trail proved that he was the most calculating, predatory criminal of them all, and he had just voluntarily handed me the exact map needed to destroy him. I did not wait for the morning. I immediately picked up my phone and dialed the direct line for the lead federal prosecutor assigned to Patricia and Jamal's racketeering case. When he answered, sounding exhausted from building the impending trial strategy, I informed him that I needed to submit an emergency, highly critical piece of supplementary evidence. I told him that I had just been the target of a massive, heavily funded bribery attempt designed specifically to trigger severe witness tampering and ensure my absence from the upcoming courtroom proceedings. The prosecutor's tone instantly shifted from tired to intensely alert. I requested an immediate, secure meeting at the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office for first thing the following morning. I spent the remainder of the night printing every single document I had pulled from the banking database. I compiled a brand new, meticulously organized black binder. I included the forged withdrawal authorizations, the routing numbers proving the 12-year history of grand larceny, and the precise ledgers showing my stolen inheritance flowing directly into Audrey's bank accounts. I placed the physical cashier check into a clear evidence bag, labeling it as the primary instrument of the attempted federal bribery. I did not just have enough evidence to secure Patricia's conviction anymore. I had enough hard, irrefutable data to guarantee that Richard would be joining his wife in a federal penitentiary. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the federal building downtown. The prosecutor and two senior agents were waiting for me in a sterile, windowless briefing room. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or emotional vulnerability. I opened my briefcase, placed the clear evidence bag containing the $200,000 check on the metal table, and set the new binder right next to it. I coldly and methodically walked the federal agents through the entire timeline of the theft. I explained how my parents had forged my signature 12 years ago to hijack my grandmother's trust fund, and how Richard had attempted to use those exact same stolen funds yesterday afternoon to purchase my silence. The prosecutor stared at the documented paper trail in absolute silence, completely astounded by the sheer arrogance and stupidity of my father's actions. Witness tampering is a severe federal offense, but using funds acquired through grand larceny and bank fraud to execute that tampering elevated the crime to an entirely different stratosphere of mandatory sentencing. I looked directly at the prosecutor and stated my absolute non-negotiable terms. I told him I was formally filing secondary direct criminal charges against Richard for grand larceny, wire fraud, and forgery. I wanted his remaining assets immediately seized to begin the restitution process for my stolen trust fund, and I wanted him formally indicted before the trial against Patricia commenced. The lead agent nodded, a sharp, predatory smile crossing his face as he gathered the evidence binder. He assured me that Richard's quiet, comfortable existence on the sidelines of his family's criminal enterprise was officially over. The federal government was going to tear his life apart with the exact same ruthless efficiency they were currently applying to his wife. I thanked the agents for their time, shook the prosecutor's hand, and walked out of the federal building with my head held high. Richard thought he could play the benevolent, grieving father to manipulate my emotions and save his own skin. He thought he could toss me a fraction of my own stolen money to make me disappear. Instead, he had just guaranteed his own absolute destruction. I had perfectly laid the groundwork for a total, inescapable courtroom massacre, and I was fully prepared to watch every single member of my toxic family burn under the unforgiving lights of the federal justice system. I drove to my corporate office feeling utterly invincible. My father's desperate gamble had handed me the absolute keys to my entire stolen future. The morning of the federal trial arrived with a heavy sky matching the austere atmosphere of the courthouse. I walked through the mahogany doors of the primary courtroom wearing a structured navy suit, feeling absolutely no anxiety. My father Richard was sitting rigidly at the defense table next to my mother Patricia and their high-priced criminal defense attorney. Richard looked like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had tried to bribe me weeks ago, having been formally indicted and stripped of his remaining liquid assets. Patricia, however, was already locked into full performance mode. She wore a modest beige dress, deliberately attempting to project the image of a fragile, entirely harmless suburban housewife swept up in a tragic misunderstanding. Audrey sat alone in the gallery pews, right behind them, completely broke, looking deeply and thoroughly humiliated and staring down at her scuffed shoes. Her hands trembled slightly. The defense attorney launched his opening statement with a vicious, highly calculated character assassination directed entirely at me. He paced aggressively in front of the jury box, painting me as a deeply bitter, estranged daughter who had spent my entire adult life harboring petty, irrational childhood jealousies against my younger sister. He spun a fabricated narrative claiming that I had weaponized my corporate accounting skills to frame my loving parents for simple administrative errors. He told the jury that my fierce independence was actually severe psychological instability and that I was using the federal justice system to exact revenge for not being the favorite child. When Patricia finally took the witness stand, she delivered a stellar theatrical performance. She wept openly, clutching a white tissue and wiping away endless crocodile tears as she described how she had only ever wanted to truly provide a beautiful life for her beloved children. She claimed she had absolutely no understanding of complex financial routing, digital identity theft, or commercial banking regulations, entirely blaming her fugitive son-in-law, Jamal, for orchestrating the federal crimes completely without her knowledge. She looked directly at the jury and sobbed, swearing that the stolen trust fund money was just a tragic familial misunderstanding, a desperate attempt to keep the family afloat during incredibly tough economic times. She aggressively played the ultimate victim of a cruel, ungrateful child who was trying to send her own mother to a federal penitentiary out of pure spite. She recounted fake stories of trying to hug me, of trying to bridge the gap between us, and claimed my cold demeanor was proof of my underlying cruelty. I sat in the front row of the gallery watching her theatrical sobbing without a single flinch, my expression entirely devoid of any sympathy at all. When the federal prosecutor finally called me to testify, the entire courtroom fell dead silent. The heavy wooden gate clicked shut behind me as I stepped up to the raised platform. I swore the oath with a steady voice, took my seat, and adjusted the microphone with absolute freezing precision. I did not look at my mother with anger, and I did not raise my voice to defend my character against their pathetic smear campaign. I simply opened the heavy black binder of forensic evidence resting on my lap, the precise documentation of their total ruin ready to be unleashed. The defense attorney immediately tried to rattle me during his cross-examination, stepping aggressively close to the witness box and asking condescending loaded questions about my supposed emotional estrangement from the family. He demanded to know if I enjoyed seeing my mother cry, trying to bait me into reacting maliciously. I shut him down instantly. I leaned forward and stated clearly into the microphone that my emotional state was entirely irrelevant to the objective, unalterable nature of federal banking data. I told him that math does not hold grudges, numbers do not possess jealousy, and wire fraud cannot be excused by fabricated domestic drama. The defense attorney visibly faltered, completely unprepared for a witness who refused to engage in psychological warfare. The lead federal prosecutor then took over, guiding me through the chronological, methodical presentation of the financial trails. I became the razor-sharp, highly trained professional. I was paid to be dissecting their massive criminal enterprise piece by piece for the court and the jury. I started with the initial identity theft. I requested permission to project the digital access logs directly onto the large courtroom monitors, illuminating the massive screens with undeniable hard data detailing the entire process. I highlighted the precise Internet Protocol addresses used to execute the fraudulent loans in my name. The raw data proved that the illegal credit requests were not just submitted from Jamal's downtown commercial office, but originated directly from the secure encrypted wireless network inside my parents' own suburban mansion. I pulled the specific device identifiers, proving the fraudulent applications were authorized by a personal laptop registered exclusively to Patricia. Next, I methodically dismantled their pathetic, tearful defense regarding my late grandmother's stolen trust fund. I displayed the forged withdrawal authorizations on the left monitor, placing them side by side with Patricia's verified legal signature on the right. I pointed out the distinct forensic matches, the identical pen pressure, the matching directional strokes, and the precise angle of the lettering. I explained that Patricia had not just signed her name, but had practiced forging my signature dozens of times in secret. I then traced the exact undeniable flow of the stolen inheritance, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the money did not go toward saving the family from imminent financial ruin, as she had just testified under oath. Instead, I presented the complex offshore routing numbers and the subsequent highly obscured wire transfers that funneled that exact stolen cash directly out of the country. I walked the jury through the digital laundering process, showing how Patricia and Richard willingly moved my grandmother's money through 3 different shell companies before it finally landed in Jamal's secret accounts. The courtroom was absolutely captivated as I displayed the commercial lease agreements and luxury purchase receipts pulled directly from those hidden offshore accounts. I explicitly showed the court that my stolen funds were actively being used to finance a lavish illicit second life for Jamal and his secret mistress down in Miami, Florida. I projected high-definition photographs of the beachfront condominium, the diamond jewelry purchases, and the designer handbags bought with my hijacked future. The courtroom erupted into shocked, uncontrollable murmurs. The heavy wooden gavel banged repeatedly as the judge demanded order, but the damage was already permanently inflicted. Audrey let out a loud, agonizing gasp from the gallery as the horrific reality of Jamal's infidelity, heavily funded by her parents' complicity, was broadcast into the permanent public record for everyone to see. She buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly as the absolute humiliation washed over her. Patricia's theatrical weeping completely stopped. Her fragile, carefully constructed victim facade violently shattered in a matter of seconds as the undeniable, unfeeling hard data projected on the massive screens proved her absolute malicious guilt. She stared at the monitors, her mouth hanging open, unable to formulate a single cohesive lie to defend herself. Richard sank, lower into his chair at the defense table, his face buried in his hands, completely destroyed by the financial evidence that tied him directly to the grand larceny. The defense attorney slumped back into his expensive leather chair, rubbing his temples with trembling fingers, knowing his entire courtroom strategy had just been completely incinerated by irrefutable forensic math. He did not ask a single follow-up question on redirect, realizing that engaging with me further would only dig his clients into a deeper, inescapable federal hole. The presiding federal judge looked down from the elevated bench, his expression radiating pure, unadulterated disgust. He stared directly at Patricia and Richard, his voice echoing with absolute authority through the silent room. He openly stated that in his decades sitting on the federal bench, he had rarely witnessed such a staggering, repulsive display of parental greed, manipulation, and sheer moral bankruptcy. He explicitly noted that they had not only stolen their daughter's future to fund a fraudulent, lavish lifestyle, but had actively, maliciously attempted to destroy her professional career and freedom just to cover their own despicable tracks. The judge admonished Patricia for attempting to use the courtroom as a stage for her manipulative theatrics, pointing out that her tears were nothing more than a calculated insult to the justice system. I stepped down from the witness stand, my posture straight, feeling the crushing weight of their total destruction settle into the silent, captivated room. I walked back down the center aisle, passing the defense table, without offering them a single glance of sympathy or closure. They had tried to paint me as an ungrateful, vindictive monster, and I had simply provided the court with the undeniable numeric truth of their absolute villainy. The trial was effectively over before it started. When the jury returned their verdict, it took them less than 2 hours to reach a unanimous decision on all counts. The sentencing hearing that followed a few weeks later was a masterclass in federal justice. I sat in the front row, watching as the judge delivered the absolute final blow to the people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. Patricia stood before the bench, trembling and weeping, but her tears held absolutely no currency here. The judge delivered a scathing rebuke of her maternal failures before sentencing her to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for her direct role in the massive identity theft and wire fraud conspiracy. She collapsed into her chair, a shattered shell of the status-obsessed socialite. She had once been finally forced to face a reality where her manipulative charm was completely useless. Jamal, who had been apprehended by federal marshals at a cheap motel near the southern border just days after he fled, faced an even harsher reality. His arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the terrified realization that his slick-talking charm could not manipulate a federal judge. He received 20 years without the possibility of early parole for orchestrating the multi-million-dollar commercial bank fraud and racketeering scheme, ensuring his fraudulent empire was permanently eradicated. Richard faced a different yet equally devastating kind of punishment. Because he had not actively participated in the initial identity theft, he avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but he did not escape the merciless grip of financial restitution. The judge explicitly ordered the immediate total liquidation of every single asset Richard possessed. The sprawling suburban mansion, his remaining investment portfolios, and his personal bank accounts were systematically seized and auctioned off by the government to repay the massive debt he owed me. Every single dollar he had stolen from my late grandmother's trust fund was clawed back, leaving him entirely destitute and forcing him to move into a tiny state, subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city. He was stripped of his wealth, his pride, and his family in one swift, brutal legal stroke. The man who had enabled my mother's cruelty for decades was finally left to rot in the exact same poverty he had always mocked. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed on my toxic past. My life transformed into a brilliant, peaceful sanctuary of my own making. The senior partners at my firm, deeply impressed by my unwavering composure and absolute forensic brilliance during the highly publicized federal trial, formally offered me a massive promotion. I was elevated to the position of a full partner at the firm, a milestone I achieved through my own relentless dedication and razor-sharp intellect. My corporate salary skyrocketed, and when combined with the fully restored compounding wealth of my grandmother's trust fund, I achieved a level of financial security that my parents had only ever pretended to possess. I moved out of my old apartment and purchased a stunning high-security penthouse overlooking the river, decorating it exactly as I pleased, completely free from anyone else's condescending opinions. I no longer spent my holidays bracing for emotional abuse, and I no longer shrank myself to accommodate the fragile egos of deeply insecure people. I woke up every single morning feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace, knowing that my environment was entirely protected by the iron boundaries I had fought so hard to build. The quiet mornings were no longer interrupted by frantic, manipulative phone calls or sudden demands for financial assistance. The suffocating weight of my biological family's expectations had been entirely lifted, allowing me to finally breathe the crisp, clean air of absolute freedom. I cultivated meaningful relationships with people who valued my intellect and my loyalty, building a chosen family based on mutual respect rather than toxic obligation. Every aspect of my existence was now meticulously curated to foster growth, success, and unwavering tranquility. The ultimate validation of my new reality occurred on a brisk Tuesday afternoon as I was leaving my corporate building. I had just finished a highly successful client meeting and was walking across the expansive, polished marble lobby toward the private executive elevators. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a figure lingering nervously near the main security desk. It was Audrey. The contrast between the woman standing in my lobby and the arrogant golden child I used to know was absolutely staggering. Audrey was wearing a poorly fitting stained uniform from a local budget cleaning service, her hands rough and unmanicured from scrubbing floors. Her expensive designer wardrobe had clearly been sold off long ago to cover her mounting debts and basic survival expenses. She looked thoroughly exhausted, her posture hunched as she nervously clutched a cheap canvas tote bag that looked completely foreign in her grasp. She had somehow discovered my office location and was desperately waiting to ambush me one last time, hoping to extract one final drop of sympathy. When she saw me approaching, she immediately rushed forward, her eyes wide and pleading. The building security guard stepped up to intercept her, but I raised a hand signaling that I would handle the brief interaction. I did not invite her up to my office, and I did not offer a warm greeting. I simply stopped a few feet away, my designer trench coat and immaculate briefcase standing in sharp contrast to her ragged uniform. Audrey burst into tears, launching into a pathetic, trembling speech. She begged me for a second chance, claiming that working minimum wage jobs and struggling to pay for basic groceries had finally opened her eyes to the harsh realities of the world. She wept that she was entirely alone, that her husband was locked away for decades, and that she had absolutely no one left to turn to for support. She reached out a shaking hand, desperately pleading for us to start over, to learn how to be real sisters, and to build a new family together now that the toxic influence of our parents was permanently gone. She promised she had changed, swearing that she finally understood the immense value of hard work and genuine familial bonds. I looked at her outstretched hand, feeling absolutely no urge to reach back. I did not feel pity, and I did not feel anger. I just felt an overwhelming sense of finality. I looked her directly in the eyes, my expression maintaining the exact same clinical freezing calm that had dismantled her entire life. I told her that she was only apologizing because she had completely run out of options, not because she actually felt a single ounce of genuine remorse for the decades of psychological torture she had gleefully participated in. I reminded her of the Mother's Day dinner, the exact moment that had ignited this entire sequence of events. I told her to remember how she had smirked and laughed while our mother publicly humiliated me, proudly boasting about her stolen wealth while treating me like garbage. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried the absolute unyielding weight of my final verdict. I told Audrey that on that Sunday evening, Patricia had loudly announced to the entire world that she wished she had never had a daughter. I looked at my weeping, broken sister and stated that Patricia's ultimate wish had finally come perfectly true. They no longer had a daughter, they no longer had a sister, and they no longer had a financial safety net to bleed dry. Audrey gasped, her shoulders shaking violently as the absolute permanence of my words struck her. She realized in that defining moment that there would be no emotional reunion, no financial bailout, and no forgiveness. The bridge was not just burned, it had been entirely pulverized into dust. I turned my back on her for the final time. I gave a brief nod to the security team, instructing them to escort her off the premises and ensure she never entered the building again. I walked smoothly to the private executive elevator, scanning my biometric badge. I stepped inside the gleaming, mirrored cabin, turned around and watched through the closing doors as the security guards firmly guided my sobbing, destitute sister out into the freezing cold city streets. The heavy metal doors slid completely shut, sealing away the chaotic, toxic noise of my agonizing past forever and carrying me upward into the brilliant, untouchable future I had built entirely on my own uncompromising terms. I leaned against the polished mirror of the elevator, taking a deep, restorative breath of the quiet air. I had successfully dismantled the corrupt architecture of my biological family, reclaiming my stolen inheritance and my unassailable peace of mind. As the digital floor indicator climbed higher, passing the crowded city streets below, I knew that my long, arduous journey of absolute glorious liberation was finally and forever complete.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.